My wife's office lover sent her a text saying, "Hope your clueless husband doesn't get suspicious. See you tonight." She laughed. "It was just a joke. Don't be insecure." So I played along. This morning, she woke up to a loud noise. When she ran downstairs, she fell to her knees, hysterically begging me to undo it. My name is Marcus, and I'm about to tell you the story of how I became the world's most dedicated method actor without ever setting foot on a stage. It started on a Tuesday, which should tell you everything you need to know about how mundane betrayal can be when it first walks through your door wearing sweatpants and holding a latte. Sophie's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter like it had somewhere important to be, which was ironic considering it spent most of its time glued to her palm like some kind of technological tumor. I was making scrambled eggs at the time, doing that thing where you pretend you're a chef on one of those cooking shows even though you're just a guy in boxer shorts flipping eggs with a spatula that's seen better days. The phone did that aggressive vibration dance across the granite, the kind that makes you think the device is either having a seizure or really wants your attention. I glanced down out of pure human curiosity, the same instinct that makes you look at car accidents even though you know you shouldn't, and saw the message preview light up the screen like a neon sign in a noir film. Hope your clueless husband doesn't get suspicious. See you tonight. I'm not gonna lie to you. My first thought wasn't anger or heartbreak or any of those dramatic emotions you see in movies where the protagonist throws a whiskey glass against the wall and it shatters in slow motion. No, my first thought was something closer to, well, that's interesting, mixed with a healthy dose of, did this person seriously just call me clueless in a text message on my wife's phone that I can literally see right now? The audacity was almost impressive, like watching someone rob a bank while wearing a name tag. I raised an eyebrow at the phone, then at the eggs, then back at the phone, doing this weird mental triangle of disbelief while trying not to burn breakfast, because even in moments of personal crisis, I'm still responsible about not wasting food. Sophie walked into the kitchen right then, fresh from the shower, hair wrapped in that towel turban thing that women do that somehow defies the laws of physics, and she was humming. Actually humming. Like she was in a Disney movie and birds were about to land on her shoulders and help her get dressed. I picked up the phone and held it out to her with the screen still glowing, that message sitting there like evidence at a crime scene. And I asked in the most casual voice I could muster, "Hey babe, who's texting you about your clueless husband?" I even added a little smile, the kind that probably made me look like a golden retriever who just got told he's a good boy but doesn't quite understand why. Sophie barely glanced at the screen before she laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not a caught red-handed laugh, but this full, confident, dismissive laugh that would have won her an Oscar if there was a category for best performance by a wife actively cheating on her husband. She waved her hand like she was swatting away a fly and said, "It's a joke, Marcus. Don't be insecure." The way she said insecure had this little edge to it, like she was gently reminding me that being suspicious was a personality flaw, something I should work on in therapy maybe, right after I dealt with my apparent inability to understand humor. So I smiled. I smiled and nodded and said something like, "Oh, okay, cool, because that's what the clueless husband would do, right? The clueless husband doesn't press. The clueless husband doesn't ask follow-up questions like, why would someone joke about me being suspicious unless there's something to be suspicious about? Or who exactly thinks it's funny to call me clueless in a text message? No, the clueless husband just accepts the explanation like he's accepting the terms and conditions on an iTunes update, without reading, without question, without a second thought. I kissed her on the forehead, served the eggs, and internally bookmarked the exact tone of that fake laugh the way you bookmark a recipe you know you're going to need later. I filed it away in the mental folder labeled Things to Remember When This All Falls Apart, right next to the time she said she was working late, and came home smelling like cologne that definitely wasn't mine and definitely wasn't sold at Target. The rest of that morning played out like a sitcom where I was both the comedic relief and the audience watching from home, shaking my head at the screen. I went to the grocery store and bought the stuff on the list she'd left on the fridge. Almond milk. The expensive kind that costs more than regular milk even though almonds don't even have nipples, so I'm not sure how you milk them, but whatever. I paid a bill online, the electric company one that was overdue because I'd forgotten about it, which actually fed perfectly into my new persona as the guy who can't remember basic responsibilities. I did laundry. I folded her clothes with the same care I always did. Those little rituals of marriage that suddenly felt like I was costuming a mannequin for a store window display. And through it all, I kept this running commentary in my head, this sarcastic little voice that sounded like a sports announcer calling a game. And Marcus goes for the domestic husband routine, really selling the oblivious angle here, folks. Look at him alphabetizing the spice rack. That's dedication to the craft. Humor kept me sane, honestly. I told myself, fine, be the clueless one. I'll be the world's best clueless husband. I'll win awards. They'll write articles about me in magazines. This man's wife calls him clueless, and you won't believe what he did next. The truth is, when someone calls you clueless, you don't correct them. You don't pull out a PowerPoint presentation proving your awareness and attention to detail. You don't defend your intelligence or your observational skills. You just smile and nod and let them think they're smarter than you because there's power in being underestimated. Every con artist knows this. Every poker player knows this. Every person who's ever successfully planned a surprise party knows this. If people think you don't know what's going on, they get sloppy. They get comfortable. They start making mistakes because they're not worried about covering their tracks when they think you're too dumb to follow the trail. So that's what I did. I prepared. Not loudly, not dramatically, not with any grand declarations or confrontations. I prepared the way a chess player prepares, thinking 3 moves ahead while pretending to barely understand the rules. I prepared like someone who'd just been handed a script for a role they didn't audition for, but decided they were going to absolutely nail anyway. That night, Sophie went out, said she was meeting her sister for dinner, gave me a kiss on the cheek that felt about as genuine as a $3 bill, and walked out the door in an outfit that was definitely too fancy for a casual sister dinner, unless her sister had suddenly become the Queen of England, and nobody told me. I watched her leave from the living room window, watched her check her phone before she even got to the car, watched her smile at whatever message she was reading, and I thought about that text from the morning, "See you tonight." I sat on the couch with a beer I wasn't really drinking and the TV playing some show I wasn't really watching, and I started making a mental list. Not a revenge list, not yet, just an observation list. A collection of small things that suddenly weren't so small anymore. The late nights at the office. The new perfume. The way she'd started putting her phone face down on tables. The credit card statement with the charge from that boutique hotel downtown. The one she'd explained away as a work event, even though her company's office was literally 12 minutes from our house. I wasn't angry yet. Anger would come later, probably. But right then I was just oddly calm, like I'd finally been given permission to acknowledge something I'd been trying not to see for weeks. It was almost a relief, honestly. Like when you've had a headache for so long you forget what it feels like to not have one. And then someone finally tells you it's a headache and not just your normal state of existence. The clueless husband would have sat there feeling sorry for himself, maybe cried a little, maybe called a friend to complain. But I wasn't the clueless husband anymore, not really. I was just playing one on TV, and the show was about to get a lot more interesting. People say cheating shows up in big moments. The lipstick on the collar, the perfume-soaked shirt, the classic working late excuse delivered with all the conviction of a teenager explaining why the car smells like weed. But here's what they don't tell you in all those advice columns and Reddit threads written by people with usernames like BrokenHeart2847 and Trust Issues for Life. Cheating shows up in the small things first, the tiny little breadcrumbs that you'd miss if you weren't paying attention, which of course you're not supposed to be doing, because paying attention apparently makes you controlling and insecure. Funny how that works. I learned this lesson the hard way, which is really the only way anyone learns anything important, because we're all basically toddlers in adult bodies, stumbling through life and touching hot stoves despite being repeatedly told not to. Sophie started staying late at the office. And yes, those are air quotes you're hearing in my internal monologue because at this point the office had become this magical place where people apparently worked until midnight on spreadsheets that couldn't possibly wait until morning. Her company sold marketing software, not performing emergency brain surgery or negotiating international peace treaties. But suddenly every project was life or death urgent and required her immediate attention at 8:30 p.m. on a Thursday. The perfume was new too, something I didn't recognize from the collection of bottles on her dresser that looked like a small chemistry lab devoted entirely to making women smell like various combinations of flowers that don't actually exist in nature. This scent was different, sharper, more expensive smelling, if that makes sense. The kind of perfume you don't buy at the mall, the kind you buy at one of those boutique stores where they call it fragrance and act offended if you ask how much it costs, because if you have to ask, you clearly don't understand the artistry involved in making someone smell like a forest in France at sunset or whatever. And then there was the phone thing. Oh, the phone thing. Sophie suddenly cared more about unread messages than she cared about our anniversary, which had rolled around 3 weeks after that initial clueless husband text and had been celebrated with all the enthusiasm of someone showing up to a dentist appointment. I'd made reservations at that Italian place she liked, the one with the overpriced pasta that comes in portions so small you're basically paying $28 for a modern art installation that happens to be edible. She'd checked her phone 7 times during dinner. I counted. I'm not proud of counting, but I did it anyway because apparently I'd become the kind of person who keeps mental tallies of digital interruptions like some kind of sad statistician of marital decline. My friend Oliver was the one who really opened my eyes to the financial side of things. And let me tell you about Oliver for a second because he's important to this story and also because he's the kind of friend everyone needs when their life is actively falling apart. Oliver drinks too much espresso, like an amount of espresso that would probably kill a small horse, and has this nervous energy that makes him seem like he's always one caffeine hit away from either solving cold fusion or vibrating through the floor into another dimension. He works in finance, something to do with forensic accounting that he's tried to explain to me multiple times, but always loses me around the part where he starts talking about discrepancy patterns and audit trails with the same excitement most people reserve for talking about their favorite TV shows. We were having lunch at this sandwich shop that tries way too hard to be artisanal. You know the kind, where the menu is written in chalk and they act like putting bacon on a BLT is some kind of revolutionary culinary insight. When Oliver casually mentioned that he'd noticed some interesting activity on the joint account Sophie and I shared. He said it in that careful way people use when they're about to tell you something that's going to ruin your day, but they're trying to ease into it like they're lowering you into a cold pool instead of just pushing you in. Interesting how, I asked, even though I already knew I didn't want to hear the answer. The same way you don't want to hear the weird noise your car is making explained by a mechanic because you know it's going to cost you money you don't have. Oliver pulled out his phone, because of course he had receipts. Oliver always has receipts. The man documents his life like he's building a case for a congressional hearing, and showed me a series of small transfers that didn't fit our normal spending patterns. $20 here, $45 there. Amounts small enough that you wouldn't notice them unless you were looking, which I hadn't been because I'd been too busy being the clueless husband who thought everything was fine. The transfers were going to apps I didn't recognize. Payment services that could have been for anything, but probably weren't for anything good. Could be nothing, Oliver said, which is what people say when they know for sure it's something, but they want you to come to that conclusion on your own so they don't feel responsible for blowing up your life. But usually, when people start moving money around in weird little amounts like this, they're either planning something or hiding something. I made a joke about it at dinner that night, something about Sophie's new work ethic and how dedicated she was to the company. Really going above and beyond, possibly deserving a raise or at least a plaque that said, employee most likely to answer emails at midnight. I delivered it with a smile that I'd been practicing in the bathroom mirror like a method actor preparing for the role of oblivious spouse in a made-for-TV movie that would air on a Sunday afternoon when people were too hungover to change the channel. Sophie laughed, but it was that tight laugh again, the one from the kitchen, the one I'd bookmarked in my mental library of sounds that mean I'm being lied to. The truth was, my chest was tightening. Not in a dramatic movie way where the guy clutches his shirt and falls to his knees, but in that slow, creeping way where you suddenly become aware of your own breathing and realize it's taken more effort than it should. It's the feeling you get when you're putting together a puzzle and you keep forcing pieces that don't quite fit because you want them to fit. Because if they don't fit, then the whole picture is wrong and you wasted all that time on something broken. I kept up the act, though, because that's what I'd committed to doing. Clueless husband, happily clueless, blissfully unaware of the small earthquakes happening in his own marriage. I watched Sophie pocket her phone like it was a secret puppy she was smuggling out of a store, quick and guilty, and trying too hard to seem casual about it. She'd gotten into this habit of receiving a text and then immediately standing up to go to another room to read it, always with some excuse like she needed to check something or grab something or do something that definitely couldn't be done in the same room where her husband was sitting. Funny thing about small things, they add up. It's like how you don't notice you're gaining weight until suddenly your pants don't fit and you're standing in front of your closet having an existential crisis about whether jeans shrink on their own or if you've been lying to yourself about those late-night pizza orders. Each small thing on its own is explainable, dismissible, the kind of thing you can rationalize away if you're committed enough to not seeing what's right in front of you. But when you start collecting them, when you line them up like evidence on a murder board in a detective show, suddenly the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The late nights became a routine. The perfume became a regular occurrence. The phone became an extension of her body, more important than our actual conversations, which had devolved into these surface-level exchanges about groceries and bills and whether we needed to call someone about the weird noise the dishwasher was making. We'd become roommates who occasionally had sex, and even that had become less frequent, less enthusiastic, more of a scheduled maintenance check than anything resembling actual intimacy. I started paying attention to other things too, small things I'd been ignoring because I'd been operating under the assumption that my marriage was basically fine, just going through a rough patch, nothing that couldn't be fixed with better communication or maybe a vacation we couldn't afford. The way she'd started doing her makeup differently, more carefully, on days when she claimed to be going to the office. The way she'd bought new underwear, the fancy kind that comes in those expensive boutique boxes, not the practical cotton stuff she usually wore around the house. The way she'd suddenly developed opinions about restaurants I'd never heard of and movies she'd somehow seen without me. Oliver texted me one night while I was sitting on the couch pretending to watch a basketball game I didn't care about. "You doing okay, man?" It was one of those check-in texts that your friends send when they know you're not okay, but they're giving you the opportunity to either open up or lie about it. I appreciated the gesture even as I typed back, "Yeah, all good," because I wasn't ready to say out loud what I was starting to understand. Saying it out loud would make it real, and I was still living in that weird liminal space between suspicion and confirmation, that purgatory where you know, but you don't officially know, so you can still maintain plausible deniability if anyone asks. The smallest things become evidence when you pay attention, when you stop giving people the benefit of the doubt, when you start trusting your gut instead of their explanations. A text message that gets deleted too quickly, a receipt that doesn't match the story, a phone call taken in the garage, a sudden interest in privacy where there wasn't any before. These aren't smoking guns. They're breadcrumbs, and I'd become the guy following them through the forest, knowing full well they probably led to somewhere I didn't want to go, but unable to stop walking anyway, because at least walking gave me something to do besides sit still and pretend everything was fine when it clearly, obviously, painfully wasn't. While she slept, I learned the quiet arts, and let me tell you, there's something deeply weird about becoming a spy in your own marriage. Like you've suddenly been cast in a thriller movie except the budget is terrible, and instead of cool gadgets you've got a 7-year-old laptop and a growing sense of betrayal that sits in your stomach like bad Chinese food. I never thought I'd be the guy who snoops, who investigates, who turns into some kind of discount private detective operating out of his own living room at 2 in the morning with only the glow of a computer screen for company. But life has a funny way of turning you into exactly the person you swore you'd never become. Backups became my new religion. Screenshots became my gospel. Receipts became my holy texts. I approached the collection of evidence with the dedication of a museum curator assembling an exhibit, except instead of ancient pottery, I was cataloging modern betrayal, which honestly feels like it should be its own wing in a museum somewhere. The Hall of Shattered Trust, sponsored by whoever makes those little surveillance cameras you can buy on Amazon for like $30. Oliver taught me how to mirror a phone, which sounds way more high-tech and Jason Bourne than it actually is, but I'm going to let you think it was cool because it made me feel competent for approximately 15 minutes before I remembered why I was learning this skill in the first place. Oliver walked me through it over beers at his place, his apartment that looks like a tech startup threw up in it. Monitors everywhere, cables running across the floor like electronic spaghetti, and enough empty energy drink cans to build a small fortress. He explained it in that patient way people explain technology to their parents, like he was teaching me how to use email for the first time. It's not because you're techie, Oliver said, pulling up some software that looked intimidatingly complex, full of menus and options and things I definitely didn't understand. It's because you need receipts. You need documentation. You need proof that's undeniable, the kind of proof that holds up in court if it comes to that. I told him I wasn't techie, which is an understatement. I'm the guy who still uses the same password for everything and thinks the cloud sounds like something from a children's book rather than actual technology. But Oliver was patient, walking me through each step like he was teaching me a recipe. Except instead of baking a cake, I was learning how to basically clone my wife's digital life onto my own devices. It felt invasive and necessary in equal measure, like I was violating privacy in order to uncover violations, which is the kind of moral paradox that keeps you up at night if you think about it too hard. So I tried not to think about it too hard. The first thing that came through when the mirroring started working was a text thread with a name I didn't recognize, Adrian. Because of course his name was Adrian. It couldn't be something normal like Dave or Mike. It had to be Adrian, which sounds like the kind of name you give a character in a romance novel who's described as having smoldering eyes and chiseled features, and probably owns a motorcycle he doesn't need, but rides anyway because it makes him look dangerous and interesting. I read through those texts at 3 a.m. while Sophie slept upstairs, her phone sitting on the nightstand next to her like a ticking time bomb she was completely unaware of. I sat in the home office we'd set up in the spare bedroom, the one we'd talked about maybe turning into a nursery someday back, when we still talked about someday like it was a real place we might actually visit. The messages loaded slowly, chronologically, starting from months back, and watching them populate on my screen felt like watching a car crash in reverse. You know how it ends, but seeing how it begins is somehow worse. The early messages were innocent enough, or at least innocent-ish. Work stuff, meeting confirmations, those kinds of professional exchanges that could have been between any two colleagues who had to collaborate on projects. But then they shifted. The way conversations shift when people start testing boundaries. When looking forward to our meeting becomes looking forward to seeing you. And suddenly there's subtext thick enough to cut with a knife. The emojis started appearing, those little digital hieroglyphics that mean everything and nothing. The winky faces and the hearts and the inside jokes I wasn't part of. I pulled hotel bookings next, because once you've crossed the line into full-scale digital espionage, you might as well go all in, right? Might as well commit to the bit. I found reservations at boutique hotels, the kind with names like the Riverside Inn or Hotel Moderne, that try to sound European and sophisticated but are really just charging you $200 a night for a room that's basically a fancy box with a bed in it. The dates matched up with nights Sophie had claimed to be working late or attending conferences, and seeing them lined up like that, the lies next to the truth, the excuses next to the evidence, felt like getting punched in the chest by someone wearing brass knuckles made of calendar entries. There were lingerie orders too, purchases made on our joint credit card because apparently Sophie had gotten comfortable enough in her deception to not even bother hiding the financial trail. I found receipts from stores with names like Secrets and Lace and The Intimate Collection, places I'd never been invited to shop at, orders for things I'd certainly never seen her wear at home. $60 bras, $70 panties, matching sets in colors she'd never shown me, all charged to a card that had my name on it too. The irony was so thick you could spread it on toast. I was literally funding my own cuckolding, like some kind of twisted crowdfunding campaign for my wife's affair. Calendar entries told another story, one of late-night dinners at restaurants I'd never heard her mention, at places with Michelin stars and waiting lists, and the kind of menus where they describe each ingredient like it's a character in an epic poem. Pan-seared scallops with locally sourced microgreens and a reduction of something or other type places, where you pay $40 for 3 bites of food arranged artistically on a plate the size of a hubcap. She'd been building a whole separate life, complete with date nights and romantic dinners, while I'd been at home eating leftover pizza and watching Netflix shows I didn't care about. I made folders on my computer with names that started out practical, evidence, documentation, Sophie's phone backup, but as the collection grew and my anger calcified into something harder and colder, the names got more creative. Proof, do not open unless angry, became my favorite, though I also created the greatest hits of betrayal. And remember this when she cries. which in retrospect might reveal more about my mental state than I'm comfortable admitting, but whatever, we're past the point of pretending I was handling this with perfect emotional stability. I felt ridiculous and powerful at the same time, like a supervillain whose superpower is really good organization and a basic understanding of cloud storage. Ridiculous because I was spending my nights screenshotting text messages and saving receipts like some kind of obsessed archivist of infidelity. Powerful because for the first time since this whole nightmare started, I had control over something. I had information she didn't know I had, leverage she couldn't see, ammunition she'd handed me without realizing it. My files turned into a collage of betrayal, a digital scrapbook of the worst moments of my marriage, carefully curated and meticulously organized. I had the tacky receipts, literally tacky, printed on that thermal paper that fades if you look at it wrong, sitting next to screenshots of hotel selfies. Those couples' photos taken in bathroom mirrors with Sophie making that face she makes when she thinks she looks sexy. The one where she tilts her head and does this thing with her eyes that I used to think was cute, but now just made me want to throw my laptop across the room. It was messy art, the kind of art installation you'd see in a contemporary museum where the placard next to it would read something pretentious like dissolution, a study in modern love, and people would stand around nodding thoughtfully while secretly wondering if the artist was okay. Except I was both the artist and the subject, creating documentation of my own destruction, cataloging the evidence of my wife's affair with the same attention to detail I'd once used to plan our wedding. There were photos too, ones she'd sent to Adrian that had somehow synced to the cloud, because people always forget about the cloud until it comes back to haunt them like some kind of digital ghost. Pictures I won't describe in detail because some things are too painful to relive, and also because I'm trying to maintain at least a shred of dignity in the retelling of this story. But let's just say they confirmed everything I already knew and added several things I'd been better off not knowing. The weird part was how methodical it all became, how routine. I'd wait for Sophie to fall asleep, give it an extra 20 minutes to be safe, then creep downstairs like a teenager sneaking out, except I was sneaking into my own office to spy on my own wife. I'd make myself coffee even though it was midnight because at that point sleep was theoretical anyway, and I'd spend hours organizing files, cross-referencing dates, building timelines like I was preparing for trial even though I had no idea yet what the trial would be. Oliver would text me during these late-night sessions, checking in with messages like, "You still up?" and "Find anything new?" Because he'd become invested in this too, like he was my accomplice in evidence gathering, my partner in documentation crimes. I'd send him screenshots sometimes, the particularly damning ones, and he'd respond with reactions ranging from shocked emoji to "holy shit, man," to longer messages about what this meant legally and financially, always thinking 3 steps ahead, because that's how his brain works. The collection grew. Every night brought new additions to the archive, new pieces of the puzzle, new evidence that made the picture clearer and somehow worse. I became a detective with poor fashion sense and worse coping mechanisms, trading sleep for screenshots, trading peace of mind for proof, building a case against someone I'd once promised to love forever, using skills I never wanted to learn to document a betrayal I never wanted to experience. I didn't like lawyers. This was a position I'd held firmly for most of my adult life, developed through a combination of watching too many legal dramas where everyone's morally ambiguous and wears suits that cost more than my car. And that one time I got a parking ticket, and the lawyer I consulted charged me $200 to tell me I should just pay the $70 ticket. Lawyers, in my experience, were people who made simple things complicated and then charged you by the hour for the privilege of being confused in their presence. But now I absolutely adore one, which just goes to show that life will make you eat your words and then bill you for the meal. Miles Crane walked into the coffee shop where we'd agreed to meet looking exactly like what a successful lawyer should look like. Sharp suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, better posture than a ballet dancer, the kind of haircut that requires maintenance appointments and product with names like texturizing pomade, instead of just regular gel like us normal people use. He was the kind of man who reads fine print the way other people read comic strips, for fun, probably while eating breakfast and genuinely enjoying himself. I knew I'd found the right person when he sat down, ordered an espresso that came in a cup roughly the size of a thimble, and asked me, "So, how badly did she screw you?" before I'd even finished explaining why I'd called. Oliver had recommended Miles, which made sense because Oliver somehow knows everyone who might be useful in any given crisis situation, like he's been preparing his whole life for other people's emergencies. Miles is the guy you want, Oliver had told me over the phone, his voice crackling with that caffeine-fueled certainty he always has. He's expensive, but he's a shark. And right now, you need a shark. So there I sat across from Miles Crane, Esquire, spreading out my collection of evidence like a kid showing off his Pokemon cards. Except instead of Charizards I had hotel receipts, and instead of trading with friends, I was preparing to destroy my marriage. Miles looked through everything with the focused intensity of someone reading a really good thriller, occasionally making small noises of approval or interest, jotting down notes in handwriting so neat it looked like a font. Make it legal. Make it clean. Make it final. I told him, trying to sound more confident than I felt, like I was ordering coffee instead of orchestrating the systematic dismantling of my life as I knew it. Miles looked up from the papers and smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made me understand why people pay lawyers obscene amounts of money. It was the smile of someone who'd been waiting for a puzzle worth solving, who'd been bored with straightforward divorces and custody battles, and was thrilled to have something with actual intrigue. I can work with this, he said, tapping the folder of evidence with one perfectly manicured finger. This is very workable. She's been sloppy. Over the next few weeks, while Sophie bragged about team spirit at office parties, and yes, I had to stand there nodding while she talked about how amazing her colleagues were, including Adrian, who was apparently such a team player, which is corporate speak for something very different than what she meant. Miles quietly rewired our legal house. He worked in the background like a stage crew member during a play, invisible but essential, moving pieces around while everyone else was distracted by the performance happening center stage. We met for coffee every Thursday. These sessions that looked to anyone watching like two guys discussing sports or maybe a business deal. Nothing suspicious, nothing that would raise eyebrows. Miles would update me on filings and paperwork and legal maneuvers I barely understood but trusted implicitly because he explained them with such confidence that disagreeing would have felt like questioning gravity. I joked with him once about dramatic reveals, about the fantasy of throwing papers down on a table and shouting, "You've been served," like they do in movies, and Miles laughed, but then got serious. "That's not how we're doing this," he said, stirring his espresso with the tiny spoon that came with it. "Dramatic is messy. We're going for surgical. We're going for asset protection." Asset protection. I love that phrase. It sounded so clinical, so professional, like we were discussing investment portfolios rather than the fact that my wife was sleeping with someone named Adrian who probably had abs and drove a car with unnecessary spoilers. I call it installing a safety net where she thought there was a trampoline. I told Miles, and he actually laughed, wrote it down in his legal pad. There's a rhythm to revenge planning, I discovered. It's surprisingly mundane once you get into it. Not at all like the movies where everything happens in dark rooms with dramatic lighting. Our rhythm involved a lot of coffee. Miles with his espressos that cost $7 for 2 sips. Me with my regular drip coffee that the barista judged me for ordering, and signatures. Endless signatures on documents I pretended to read thoroughly, but mostly just trusted Miles had gotten right. Contracts, amendments, filings, forms with names like Asset Declaration Statement and Marital Property Agreement Addendum that sounded boring enough to put you to sleep, but were actually reshaping my entire financial future. The most satisfying part was the stamp. Miles had this official notary stamp in his office, one of those heavy metal ones that made a satisfying thunk when it hit paper. And every time he stamped a document, I felt like we were sealing something important, like we were making it real and official and undeniable. It was weirdly therapeutic, watching that stamp come down on paper, leaving its mark, making everything legitimate and legal and final. She has no idea, does she? Miles asked me once, during one of our Thursday sessions, and I shook my head. Sophie was still coming home late, still texting Adrian, still living in the bubble of her affair like it was sustainable, like there wouldn't be consequences, like she'd somehow gotten away with something when really she'd just been giving me time to prepare. None, I said. She thinks I'm clueless. Miles smiled that shark smile again. Good. Let's keep it that way. You don't have to shout to trap someone, which is a lesson I learned from watching way too many heist movies during my newfound insomnia period. Those nights, when sleep became this theoretical concept other people enjoyed, while I stayed up planning the downfall of my marriage with the dedication of someone preparing for the SATs. The best traps are quiet, subtle, the kind that make the person think they're still in control right up until the moment they realize they never were. Like those cartoons where the coyote runs off a cliff and doesn't fall until he looks down and notices there's nothing beneath him. I started leaving Sophie's phone unlocked, which sounds counterintuitive when you're trying to catch someone in a lie, but hear me out. Before, she'd been careful, paranoid even, keeping that thing locked down tighter than Fort Knox, changing her passcode every few weeks like she was guarding nuclear launch codes instead of text messages with Adrian about which hotel had the softest bathrobes. But I'd learned her new passcode during one of my late-night espionage sessions, watched her type it in through the reflection in the kitchen window while pretending to wash dishes, because apparently I'd become the kind of person who uses reflective surfaces for surveillance, which is either really clever or really sad, depending on how you look at it. So I started unlocking her phone when she wasn't looking and leaving it that way, face up on the counter or the coffee table or wherever she'd set it down. The first time she noticed, she panicked. I watched her face go through this whole journey. Confusion, then fear, then this forced casual expression as she grabbed the phone and checked it, fingers moving fast across the screen, probably scrolling through messages to see if I'd seen anything incriminating, which of course I had, weeks ago, but she didn't know that. "Did you use my phone?" she asked, trying to sound curious rather than accusatory, like she was asking if I'd borrowed her car keys instead of potentially discovering her affair. I looked up from the book I wasn't actually reading and gave her my best confused golden retriever expression, the one I'd been perfecting in the bathroom mirror during my morning routine. "What? No. Why would I use your phone?" I even added a little laugh, like the idea of me being interested in her phone was absurd, like I couldn't possibly care less about her digital life. She relaxed, but not completely. That was the point. I wanted her just uncomfortable enough to make mistakes, to feel like maybe her security wasn't as tight as she thought, to second-guess herself in ways that would slowly erode the confidence she'd built up during months of successful sneaking around. I started casually asking about names she'd mentioned, dropping them into conversation like I was just making small talk, innocent questions that weren't innocent at all if you knew what I knew. "How's that Adrian guy from work doing? You mentioned him the other day." Her laugh would tighten, her shoulders would tense just slightly, and she'd give these vague responses that told me everything I needed to know about how much energy she was spending keeping her story straight. The false bank notices were Miles's idea, printed on official-looking letterhead that he'd had made, slipped into our mail stack between the credit card offers and the grocery store coupons. Important, account discrepancy requires immediate attention, in bold letters across the top. Scary enough to make her nervous, but vague enough that when I resolved it with a phone call she thought was real, she'd believe everything was fine. Each fake crisis I manufactured and solved reinforced the idea that I was handling things, that I was on top of our finances, that I was absolutely not the kind of person who would notice irregular spending patterns or mysterious transfers. I mentioned refinancing ideas at dinner, casual observations about interest rates and equity, like I'd suddenly developed an interest in personal finance beyond just making sure we could pay the bills. "We should look into refinancing the house," I said over takeout Chinese food that neither of us was really eating. "Rates are good right now. Could save us a bunch of money." Sophie barely looked up from her phone. Of course she didn't. She was probably texting Adrian about their next rendezvous, and made some non-committal noise that I took as agreement to explore the option further. These little traps, these small manipulations, they made sure she felt this slow thawing of confidence, like ice melting so gradually you don't notice until suddenly you're standing in a puddle. She'd gotten comfortable in her deception, arrogant even, and I was systematically making her just uncomfortable enough to keep her off balance without tipping her off that I knew everything. At parties, I played the clown, the comic relief, the guy who forgets names and dates and tells stories that go nowhere and laughs too loud at his own jokes. I became that person everyone tolerates because he's harmless, the husband who's just happy to be included, who doesn't notice when his wife spends 40 minutes talking to Adrian in the corner while he's busy discussing barbecue techniques with someone's cousin who won't stop talking about his new grill. "Oh man, is today our anniversary?" I said once at a dinner party, loud enough for everyone to hear. including Sophie, who looked mortified. I always mix up the date. Everyone laughed. Sophie gave me this tight smile that said we'd discuss this later, and I'd successfully reinforced my image as the lovable idiot who couldn't remember important dates, the kind of guy who definitely wasn't systematically documenting his wife's affair and planning a legal counteroffensive with a lawyer who charged $500 an hour. At night, after Sophie fell asleep, I'd sit in the dark living room rehearsing lines I'd never speak, at least not yet. I'd practice different versions of confrontation, different ways of revealing what I knew, playing out scenarios like I was preparing for a performance. I know about Adrian. Too simple. I've known for months. Too smug. Did you really think I wouldn't find out? Too obvious. I'd cycle through options like I was trying on clothes, looking for the perfect fit, the perfect tone, the perfect devastating reveal. Sarcastically, I told myself I'd earned acting classes, that I deserved an Oscar for my performance as the oblivious husband who suspects nothing. In truth, I earned something better, a quiet satisfaction that grew each day as I watched Sophie lose the certainty she'd weaponized for months. She'd used my trust against me, had counted on my belief in her, had banked on me being exactly who she thought I was, trusting, naive, too in love to see what was right in front of me. But every little trap I set, every small test she failed without knowing she was being tested, every moment of manufactured confusion that made her question whether her secret was still safe. Those were taking back the power she'd stolen. I wasn't the clueless husband anymore. I was just playing one on TV, and the season finale was going to be spectacular. Refinancing the house sounded boring, which was exactly the point. If I'd proposed something exciting, something that required actual attention or consideration, Sophie might have actually read the documents I was about to put in front of her. But refinancing? That's the kind of adult paperwork that makes people's eyes glaze over faster than listening to someone explain their fantasy football strategy or watching paint dry in real time. It's up there with tax forms and insurance policies on the list of things nobody actually wants to deal with, but everyone pretends to understand when they sign on the dotted line. It was the best boring thing that ever happened to me, and I mean that with the kind of sincere appreciation usually reserved for discovering your favorite restaurant has a secret menu or finding $20 in a jacket you haven't worn since last winter. Miles had prepared everything with the precision of a surgeon planning a particularly delicate operation. Except instead of removing a tumor, he was removing my wife's claim to our house, which honestly felt pretty similar in terms of life-improving procedures. The documents were beautiful in their complexity, the kind of legal paperwork that looks official and important with all the right headers and footers, and whereas clauses that make it seem legitimate even if you have no idea what half the words mean. Miles had buried the actual transfer deep in the stack, surrounded by so much financial jargon and legal boilerplate that finding it would require the kind of careful reading that nobody does when their lawyer husband says, "Hey, can you just sign these refinancing papers real quick?" I set the stage over coffee on a Saturday morning, because Saturday mornings in our house had become this ritual of pretending everything was normal while both of us lived completely separate lives that occasionally intersected over breakfast. Sophie was doing that thing where she scrolled through Instagram while drinking her latte, double-tapping photos of other people's lives with the same mindless dedication most people reserve for breathing, not really present, not really there, just existing in the same physical space as me while her mind was probably already planning her next meetup with Adrian. "Hey babe," I said, keeping my tone light and casual, the verbal equivalent of elevator music, pleasant, forgettable, completely unthreatening. "I finally got those refinancing papers from the bank. We should really sign these today. The rate lock expires Monday, and we'll lose the good terms if we don't move on it." I'd learned that adding a deadline makes people less likely to scrutinize things. Time pressure is the enemy of careful consideration. It's why car salesmen always tell you the deal is only good until the end of the day, why infomercials have those countdown timers, why Black Friday works even though everyone knows the sales will probably come back around again. Create urgency, and people make decisions without thinking them through, which is exactly what I was counting on. Sophie looked up from her phone with that slightly annoyed expression people get when they're interrupted from something they consider important, even though literally all she was doing was looking at pictures of someone's brunch. "Refinancing? I thought we talked about this." "We did," I said, which was technically true. I'd mentioned it approximately 17 times over the past month, each time getting a distracted or yeah, sure, or whatever you think is best, honey, because she'd been too busy managing her double life to pay attention to mundane things like our actual shared life. This is the next step. Just need your signature on a few forms, and we're good to go. Should save us like $400 a month. The money angle helped. People perk up when you mention saving money, even when they're not paying attention to where the money is or isn't going. Sophie set down her phone, miracle of miracles, and reached for the papers I'd stacked neatly on the table, held together with one of those big black binder clips that makes everything look more official. She skimmed, and by skimmed, I mean her eyes moved across the pages in that way that gives the appearance of reading without any actual comprehension happening, like a scanner that's just checking for blank spaces rather than processing content. She flipped through pages, nodded at things she clearly wasn't absorbing, occasionally making small noises of acknowledgement that could have meant anything from, I understand this, to, I'm pretending to understand this, to, I have no idea what this says, but I trust you're not screwing me over. Oh, the irony. The delicious, perfect irony of her trusting me not to screw her over while she was actively screwing someone else. If irony was a food, I could have opened a restaurant with what I was serving in that moment. Where do I sign? She asked, already reaching for the pen I'd strategically placed next to the papers. A nice heavy pen that made signatures feel important and official, the kind of pen banks give you when you're signing mortgage documents or loan papers, or, in this case, unknowingly transferring the deed to your house entirely into your husband's name. I pointed to the little sticky tabs Miles had put on each page that required a signature. Those colorful sign here, arrows that make paperwork feel manageable, like you're just following instructions rather than making potentially life-altering legal decisions. Sophie signed each one without hesitation, her signature flowing across the pages with the same casual confidence she'd had throughout this entire affair. The same certainty that she was getting away with something, that she was smarter than me, that I was too clueless to ever figure out what was happening. Her signature was distinctive, one of those swooping cursive things that people develop in high school and then use for the rest of their lives without ever questioning whether it actually looks like their name or just like a seismograph during an earthquake. I watched each one appear on the paper like I was watching a magic trick in reverse, where instead of something appearing out of nothing, something very important was disappearing. Her claim to our house, her security, her leverage. She signed the last page, set down the pen, and went back to fluffing her hair in that absent way she had, checking her reflection in the black screen of her phone before it lit up with what was probably another message from Adrian. All done, she asked, already distracted again, already mentally somewhere else. All done, I confirmed, gathering the papers carefully, resisting the urge to hold them against my chest like I was protecting the Holy Grail or the Declaration of Independence or something equally precious and historically significant. Miles handed me the stamped copy later that week, meeting me at our usual coffee shop with a manila envelope that contained my future security. He slid it across the table like a spy passing secrets in a Cold War movie. Except instead of microfilm or state secrets, it was legal documents that meant I now solely own the house Sophie thought we still owned together. She signed, he said with that half-smile he got when things went according to plan, and I could tell he was enjoying this almost as much as I was, living vicariously through my revenge plot like it was the most interesting thing happening in his professional life, which considering he usually dealt with boring corporate contracts, it probably was. I held the documents like they were tickets to a show, because in a way they were. Tickets to the final act, the closing scene, the moment when everything I'd been planning would finally come together. I didn't gloat, at least not outwardly. Gloating wasn't the point. The point was the power of a pen, the weight of a signature, the way a single cursive swirl could shift the entire foundation of someone's life without them even realizing it until it was far too late to take it back. Adrian, Sophie's office friend, who I'm sure described himself on dating apps as alpha male and entrepreneur mindset, even though he worked in middle management at a software company, sent a smug text to a colleague that I intercepted through my phone mirroring setup. The message read, "You should thank me, man. I'm keeping her happy for you." Because apparently Adrian thought he was doing me some kind of favor, like he was a public service announcement or a charity organization dedicated to servicing neglected wives. which is the kind of delusional thinking that comes from a man who probably refers to himself in the third person and owns at least 3 different types of protein powder. Men talk like they're writing oil field memos when they brag, all efficiency and self-importance, reducing human relationships to transactions and conquests like they're collecting baseball cards instead of destroying marriages. The casual cruelty of it, the assumption that I'd somehow be grateful for his services, the sheer audacity of thinking he was entitled to both my wife and my thanks. It was almost impressive in its complete lack of self-awareness. I didn't reply to Adrian. That would have been too direct, too confrontational, too much like the dramatic showdown Sophie probably expected if I ever found out. No, I had a better idea, one that Miles approved of with that predatory lawyer smile and Oliver endorsed with an enthusiastic hell yes. Do it over text messages that were probably too excited for someone who wasn't directly involved in the situation. I forwarded everything to his wife, Rachel. Not just the text about keeping Sophie happy, but the whole collection, the hotel receipts with both their names, the restaurant reservations, the text threads where Adrian complained about his boring home life and talked about how Sophie understood him in ways his wife didn't, which is the kind of cliché affair talk that sounds like it was copied from a bad romance novel written by someone who learned about relationships from watching soap operas. I'd found Rachel through Adrian's social media, because people are shockingly bad at privacy settings when they think they're untouchable. She had one of those Facebook profiles that was mostly pictures of their kids and inspirational quotes about family and love, the kind of digital presence that made the betrayal feel even worse because you could see exactly what Adrian was risking for hotel sex and validation from my wife. I sent the evidence from an anonymous email account Oliver helped me set up with a simple message. I'm sorry you have to find out this way. You deserve to know the truth about your husband and Sophie Martinez. Short, direct, devastating. I didn't editorialize, didn't add commentary, just let the evidence speak for itself because sometimes the facts are brutal enough without embellishment. The reaction was immediate and deliciously chaotic, like watching dominoes fall or a Rube Goldberg machine of relationship destruction play out in real time. Rachel called Adrian 17 times in the span of an hour. I know because his phone was connected to his smartwatch and the notifications showed up on Sophie's mirrored feed since they'd been texting about meeting up later that day. Her voice breaking, then furious, leaving messages that escalated from "please call me" to "you lying piece of shit" in the span of maybe 3 voicemails. The firm called HR by noon the next day because Rachel had apparently forwarded everything to Adrian's boss with a detailed explanation of how company resources, specifically corporate credit cards and company time, had been used for the affair. Nothing gets a company's attention quite like potential liability and misuse of corporate funds. Turns out, who knew accounting departments could move so fast when properly motivated? Adrian began having sudden personal emergencies that required him to leave work early, miss meetings, and generally become unreliable in ways that his performance reviews probably hadn't reflected before. Sophie's texts to him became increasingly panicked. What's happening? Why aren't you answering? Did something happen with Rachel? And I watched them come through like I was reading a thriller novel where I already knew the ending, but still enjoyed seeing how the characters reacted to their inevitable downfall. Sophie's world started vibrating like a cheap phone on silent mode that finally hit the table, that kind of persistent buzzing that you can't ignore even though you want to. That tells you something important is happening whether you're ready for it or not. Her office became tense. Her texts became frantic. Her careful compartmentalization started breaking down as the affair that had existed in this protected bubble suddenly became exposed to consequences and reality. I watched the dominoes fall, not loudly, but with a chaotic dignity that felt oddly poetic, like watching a carefully constructed house of cards collapse in slow motion. Adrian's marriage imploding, his professional reputation tanking, Sophie's secure little secret becoming public knowledge among their colleagues, the comfortable affair suddenly becoming a liability instead of an escape. I wanted her to feel the crash, not just hear about it, because there's a fundamental difference between being told your life is falling apart and experiencing it in real time with all 5 senses engaged. It's the difference between someone describing what it's like to fall off a cliff and actually standing at the edge watching the ground rush up to meet you, knowing there's nothing you can do to stop what's coming. Miles arranged the timing with the precision of a military operation, coordinating with the bank to freeze our joint accounts at exactly 6 a.m. on a Thursday, which he'd chosen specifically because Thursday is that weird day where people are too tired to think clearly but not close enough to the weekend to have hope. Oliver practiced his shocked neighbor face in my bathroom mirror the night before, workshopping different levels of surprise and concern until we found the right balance of, "I can't believe this is happening," and "I'm here to support you, buddy," which was honestly more method acting than either of us expected to be doing in our mid-30s. But here we were. I hired a locksmith I'd found through one of those apps where everyone is anonymous and paid in cash, told him I was locked out of my own house, which was technically true since I'd deliberately left my keys inside earlier. He showed up at 5:30 in the morning looking like he'd rather be anywhere else, changed the locks on both doors in under 20 minutes, and left without asking questions because apparently locksmiths at that hour have seen enough weird stuff that a guy changing locks on his own house barely registers as interesting. The accounts were frozen overnight, funds moved into safe places under my control, a personal account Miles had helped me establish months ago, transfers that looked like normal financial management to anyone who wasn't paying extremely close attention. Sophie's credit cards, all of them joint accounts she'd been using to fund her fancy dinners and hotel stays, suddenly declined. Her access to our savings, gone. The financial foundation she'd been taking for granted while building her affair, removed as efficiently as pulling a tablecloth out from under dishes, except the dishes were definitely going to fall. Then I staged a loud collapse in the living room. And I mean staged like I was setting up a scene from a disaster movie. I'd opened the safe we kept in the office closet, the one where we stored important documents and some jewelry and a small amount of emergency cash, and emptied it completely, distributing the contents to locations Sophie would never find. The display case in our living room, the one with Sophie's grandmother's china that she insisted we keep even though we never used it, I carefully emptied, and then strategically broke, scattering glass across the hardwood floor like confetti at a funeral. Sad, glittering, impossible to ignore. I knocked over furniture, left drawers pulled out, created the appearance of chaos that would be immediately visible the moment anyone came downstairs. It looked like a robbery, or at least like something catastrophic had happened, which I suppose was accurate in a metaphorical sense even if the actual catastrophe was entirely orchestrated. Then I screamed. Not my proudest moment, but I committed to the performance. I yelled, "Sophie, Sophie, get down here," with genuine urgency in my voice because even though I was faking the emergency, the emotion behind it was real. Months of anger and betrayal and calculated planning all channeled into that moment of theatrical panic. Sophie ran downstairs, squinting without her contacts in, hair wild like she'd been electrocuted, mascara already streaked from whatever she'd failed to wash off the night before. She took in the scene, the scattered glass, the open safe, the disorder I'd carefully constructed, and her face went through this rapid evolution of expressions that would have been funny if it wasn't so satisfying to watch. Confusion, fear, shock, and then this dawning horror as she started to process what she thought was happening. She fell to her knees like a scene in a very bad drama, the kind of over-the-top collapse that in any other context would have made me laugh, hands covering her mouth, making these small gasping sounds that might have been words but came out more like someone hyperventilating. What happened? Oh my God, Marcus, what happened? Did someone break in? I let her panic for a moment, let her experience that free-fall feeling of losing control, of having the ground disappear beneath her feet. Then I walked to the kitchen table where I'd laid out the documents. All of them, the entire collection I'd been building for months, arranged like a museum exhibit of her choices, a gallery of betrayal with hotel receipts as the featured artwork. "Please, Marcus, please undo it," she sobbed, still on her knees, still playing the victim even though she was only just beginning to understand that the real crime scene wasn't the broken glass and open safe, but rather the paper trail of her affair spread across our kitchen table under the fluorescent lights that made everything look harsh and unforgiving. I didn't say anything yet. I just gestured to the table, to the evidence, to the visual representation of every lie she'd told and every boundary she'd crossed, watching her eyes move across the papers, watching the realization hit her that this wasn't about a robbery or missing jewelry or anything she could explain away with another performance. She begged, Of course she begged. That's what people do when they realize the game is over and they weren't even close to winning. When the full weight of their actions comes crashing down like a cartoon anvil, except there's nothing funny about it. Sophie offered every performance in the book, cycling through emotions like she was auditioning for different roles and hoping one of them would land, hoping something would crack my resolve and make me forget the months of lies and hotel receipts and text messages that called me clueless while planning rendezvous behind my back. First came terror, which looked exactly like you'd expect. Wide eyes, trembling hands, that high-pitched, breathless quality to her voice like she'd just finished running a marathon, except the only thing she'd been running from was the truth. Marcus, please, I don't understand what's happening. Please just talk to me. She was still on her knees on the hardwood floor, surrounded by scattered glass from her grandmother's china, which in retrospect was maybe too on the nose as a metaphor for our shattered marriage. But I hadn't been thinking about literary symbolism when I'd staged the scene earlier that morning. I sat at the kitchen table, one hand resting on the stack of evidence I'd compiled, the other holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold about 20 minutes ago, but I kept holding anyway because it gave me something to do with my hands and made me look more casual than I felt. Talk, I said, and my voice came out calmer than I expected, almost detached, like I was discussing the weather rather than the systematic destruction of everything we'd built together. I think the documents speak for themselves, Sophie. She actually crawled, toward the table, and I had to fight the urge to tell her to stand up, to maintain some dignity, because watching someone you once loved debase themselves is uncomfortable even when they absolutely deserve it. She reached the table and pulled herself up enough to see the papers spread across the surface like evidence at a crime scene, which I suppose is exactly what they were. Her eyes scanned the first few pages, and I watched the blood drain from her face like someone had opened a valve somewhere. Hotel receipts with her name and Adrian's name next to each other. Timestamps that corresponded with nights she'd claimed to be working late or visiting her sister or attending conferences that apparently involved a lot of expensive lingerie and room service. Text message printouts where she and Adrian discussed their plans, complained about their respective spouses, made jokes about how clueless I was and how boring Rachel was. Calendar entries highlighting the pattern of deception that had been going on for, I'd counted, 7 months and 12 days. But who's keeping track? I can explain, she started, which is what people say when they absolutely cannot explain but need to buy time to construct a lie that might be more believable than the truth. It's not what it looks like. I actually laughed at that, a short bark of amusement that surprised both of us. It's not what it looks like. Sophie, there are literally photos of you and Adrian in hotel rooms with timestamps. I have your text messages where you explicitly describe what you did in those hotel rooms. I have credit card statements showing purchases of lingerie I've never seen you wear. I have restaurant reservations at places you told me you'd never been to. So please, enlighten me. What exactly does it look like to you, if not an affair? She tried the next emotion in her repertoire, regret. Her face crumpled in that theatrical way people cry in movies, big heaving sobs that shook her shoulders, mascara running down her cheeks in black rivers, hands reaching across the table toward me in supplication. I'm so sorry, Marcus. I'm so sorry. It was a mistake. It meant nothing. I love you. I've always loved you. Please, we can work through this. We can go to counseling. I'll do anything to fix this. Yes, I said, and she looked up with hope in her eyes like maybe I was agreeing to counseling, to reconciliation, to sweeping this under the rug and pretending it never happened. But I wasn't finished. Yes, it was a mistake. Your mistake. No, it wasn't nothing. It was a deliberate choice you made repeatedly for 7 months. And no, we can't work through this because there is no we anymore. I pulled out another document, one of Miles's masterpieces, and slid it across the table. These are divorce papers, already filed. You'll notice they're very unfavorable to you, which makes sense considering you committed adultery in a state that still recognizes that as grounds for at-fault divorce. You'll also notice that this house, is no longer joint property. Remember those refinancing papers you signed 3 weeks ago? The ones you didn't bother reading? Congratulations, you signed the deed over to me. Sophie's face went from tragic to stunned, her mouth literally hanging open in a way that would have been comical if I wasn't so exhausted from months of pretending. You tricked me. That's illegal. That can't be legal. Actually, it's completely legal, I said, channeling Miles's confident lawyer energy. You signed voluntarily. No coercion, no fraud. I simply failed to explain in detail what you were signing, which isn't required when both parties are adults with the ability to read. You could have read the documents. You chose not to, just like you could have chosen not to sleep with Adrian. But you did. Choices have consequences, Sophie. Welcome to yours. She tried bargaining next, the third stage of whatever grief or panic she was working through. Okay, I messed up. I know I did. But you can't just take everything. We built this life together. The house, our savings, everything. Half of it is mine. You can't just steal it. I'm not stealing anything. I corrected her, sipping my cold coffee and grimacing at the temperature, but drinking it anyway out of sheer stubborn commitment to the moment. I'm protecting my assets from someone who's been stealing from me for months. Every dinner you charged to our joint card? Theft. Every hotel room you booked with our money? Theft. Every lie you told so you could spend time with Adrian instead of with me? That's time theft, which isn't technically a legal term, but should be. I pulled out more papers, because Miles had prepared a truly impressive collection. Your access to our joint accounts has been frozen. Your credit cards have been canceled. The car that's in your name? Still yours. Congratulations, along with the payments. But the car you've been driving, the one in my name? That's being repossessed as we speak. Oliver's actually doing that right now. I gave him my spare key, and he's moving it to a storage facility where you won't find it. Sophie's eyes went even wider. If that was possible. You can't do this. This is insane. You're being crazy. And there it was, the classic move. When a woman gets caught doing something terrible, suddenly the man who reacts is crazy, or controlling, or abusive for having the audacity to be upset about being betrayed. No, Sophie. Crazy would be destroying your stuff, or keying your car, or sending the evidence to your parents. Insane would be confronting Adrian physically, or showing up at your office and making a scene. What I'm doing is methodical, legal, clean. I'm protecting myself from someone who's proven they can't be trusted. People expect revenge to be loud. I realized as I sat there watching Sophie cycle through emotions like a slot machine, trying to land on the combination that would win her some sympathy. They expect fights with raised voices and thrown objects. Expect the wrong party to lose control and do something regrettable that will let the guilty party claim victimhood. They expect breaking plates and shouting matches and dramatic declarations delivered at maximum volume. But my revenge was lean and calm, the sort that sits across from you with a cup of tea, or in this case, cold coffee, while the world burns around you and explains very rationally why the fire is your fault. I'd learned this approach from Miles, who told me during one of our planning sessions that the best legal strategy is staying calm while your opponent falls apart. That maintaining composure is a power move that makes everything you say sound more credible and everything they say sound more desperate. Sophie's face went through colors like a mood ring on someone having a breakdown. White from shock, pink from crying. Then this pale shade that might have been admiration, but was probably just the physical manifestation of her realizing exactly how thoroughly she'd been outmaneuvered. She gasped, and it came out as almost a whisper. You planned this? All of this? For how long? Since the morning you told me not to be insecure about that text message calling me your clueless husband, I said, meeting her eyes directly for the first time since she'd come downstairs. Remember that? When you laughed and told me it was a joke. I started planning that day. Every smile I gave you after that was an act. Every time I played the oblivious husband was a performance. Every joke I made about being forgetful or clueless was me giving you rope to hang yourself with. And you took it, Sophie. You took every bit of rope I offered, and you just kept going. I don't understand, she said, and I could see her trying to reprocess the last few months through this new lens, trying to figure out when I'd stopped being clueless and started being calculating. You knew? This whole time you knew, and you just let me keep doing it. I didn't let you do anything. I corrected her. You made your choices. I just made sure I had documentation of every single one. I made sure that when this moment came, and it was always going to come, Sophie, I would be protected, that I would have evidence, that I would have leverage, that I wouldn't be the clueless husband you thought I was, begging you to stay and willing to forgive anything just to avoid being alone. Her knees hit the hardwood again with a sound that made me wince despite everything, and she started crying in earnest now, not the theatrical sobs from before, but genuine ugly crying. The kind that comes with snot and hiccups and sounds that are barely human. Please, Marcus. Please. I love you. I made a mistake, but I love you. We can fix this. We can start over. I'll do anything. No, I said. Just that. One word. Simple. Final. No. No. We're done. That's the answer. We're done, Sophie. There's a peculiar silence after truth lands, louder than any shouting, more deafening than any dramatic confrontation. It's the silence of finality, of a door closing that won't open again, of a bridge burning so completely that there's not even smoke left, just ash. Sophie knelt on the floor in her pajamas surrounded by broken glass and broken promises, and I sat at the table with my cold coffee and my evidence and my carefully maintained composure. And between us was this canyon of silence that said more than any argument could have said. She tried a few more times to speak, to plead, to negotiate, but I'd already given her my only answer. The performance was over. The curtain had fallen. The lights were coming up and everyone could see exactly what had happened, exactly who was responsible, exactly how this story ended. I stood up from the table finally, leaving the papers spread out like I was leaving a crime scene for investigators to photograph. Except I was both the detective and the victim in this scenario, which was philosophically confusing but practically very satisfying. I walked past Sophie, still on her knees, still crying, and headed toward the door with my keys in my pocket and an overnight bag I'd packed and hidden in my car the night before. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice small and broken. "Anywhere that isn't here," I said without turning around. "The house is mine. You need to leave. You have until 5 p.m. to collect your personal items. Miles will be here to supervise. Make sure you don't take anything that isn't yours. After that, the locks are changed and you're officially trespassing if you come back. You can't kick me out of my own house. It's not your house anymore," I said, and turned to face her one last time. "You signed it away, remember? Along with any right to be treated with sympathy or given the benefit of the doubt. You made your choices, Sophie. Now you get to live with them." The silence that followed me out the door was absolute, complete, the kind of quiet that feels like it has weight and substance, like you could reach out and touch it if you wanted to. I closed the door behind me, didn't slam it. That would have been too dramatic, just closed it with a normal amount of force, and stood on the porch for a moment, listening to the muffled sound of Sophie's continued sobbing through the walls. It should have felt triumphant. It should have felt victorious. Instead, it just felt finished. Like the last page of a book I'd been forced to read, one I wouldn't have chosen for myself, but had to get through anyway. The ending was satisfying in a technical sense. Justice served, wrongs righted, the villain getting their comeuppance. But it was still an ending, which meant something was over, something that had once been good was now completely and irreversibly gone. I left the house with my keys in my pocket and a strange lightness in my chest. The kind of weightlessness you feel after finally setting down something you've been carrying for too long. Like when you finish moving furniture and suddenly remember what it feels like to not have your arms full of someone else's heavy stuff. The morning air hit my face and it felt different somehow, cleaner maybe, or maybe I was just projecting meaning onto weather because humans are really good at finding symbolism in random atmospheric conditions when we're going through emotionally significant moments. The man who played the fool for months walked away while the woman he loved, or loved once, past tense, because love is apparently something that can be killed slowly through hotel receipts and text messages that call you clueless, knelt among papers that documented her choices like evidence at a trial where the verdict had already been decided. I could still hear her crying through the closed door, these muffled sobs that might have broken my heart a few months ago, but now just sounded like background noise. Like a car alarm going off in a parking lot that everyone learns to ignore because it's not your car and therefore not your problem. I didn't gloat. This feels important to clarify because I think people expect the wrong party in these situations to do some kind of victory lap, to pump their fist in the air and shout something triumphant, to play "We Are the Champions" on their car stereo while driving away from the wreckage of their marriage. But gloating implies you've won something, and I'm not sure what I'd won exactly. The house. Sure. My financial security? Absolutely. My dignity? Maybe. But I'd also lost 7 years of my life to someone who'd lied to my face for the last 7 months of them, which doesn't really feel like winning when you do the math. I didn't do a victory dance either, though the thought crossed my mind, and I suppressed it like an embarrassing cough or a burp in a quiet restaurant. One of those impulses that your brain offers up as a possibility, but your better judgment immediately vetoes. There was this moment, right as I reached my car, where I imagined myself doing one of those elaborate touchdown celebrations, maybe the one where you pretend to take a bow or the one where you do a little shimmy. And I actually smiled at the absurdity of it before remembering that I was in my own driveway at 7 in the morning having just destroyed my marriage, which isn't really appropriate venue for choreographed celebrations. I'd regained my life, not by screaming or fighting or doing any of the loud, messy things that feel satisfying in movies but are mostly just exhausting in reality. I'd done it through quiet surgical strikes, through planning and patience, and performing the role of the oblivious husband so convincingly that Sophie never saw the knife coming until it was already buried in whatever metaphorical back you stab someone in when you systematically dismantle their security while they're busy having an affair. That metaphor got away from me a little bit, but you get the idea. Revenge had a taste, I realized as I sat in my car with the engine running, letting it warm up even though it was late spring and didn't really need warming up, just buying time before I had to decide where I was actually going. It wasn't sweet like people always say in those revenge success stories on Reddit where everyone gets exactly what they deserve and life works out perfectly. It wasn't bitter either, not like the cold coffee I'd forced myself to drink during the confrontation to maintain the image of casual composure. It was clean. That's the best word I could find for it. Clean, like soap or disinfectant, or that smell right after rain when everything's been washed and reset. I had what I truly wanted, which turned out to be simpler than I'd expected. Not the house, though that was nice. Not the money, though financial security beats financial instability every time. What I wanted was peace. The kind of peace that comes from not having to wonder if your spouse is lying to you. Not having to check phones or mirror devices or build evidence folders with names like proof. Do not open unless angry. The peace of knowing that when I went to bed at night, I wasn't sleeping next to someone who was probably texting someone else about what a clueless idiot I was. And I wanted the knowledge that I wasn't clueless at all. That might have been the most important thing, honestly, reclaiming my sense of self-awareness, proving to myself that I could see what was happening and respond strategically instead of emotionally. Sophie had spent months thinking she was smarter than me, more sophisticated, better at managing the complexity of a double life. She'd looked at me like I was a golden retriever who was just happy to see her when she came home, no matter where she'd been or who she'd been with. And for months I'd let her think that, had encouraged that belief, had played into it like I was auditioning for the role of world's most oblivious husband. But I wasn't oblivious. I was observant. I was patient. I was strategic in ways she never expected because she'd bought into her own narrative about who I was, had confused the performance with reality, had mistaken deliberate ignorance for actual stupidity. The best magic tricks work because the magician controls what you pay attention to, and I'd spent months directing Sophie's attention away from what I was actually doing while she was too busy managing her affair to notice I was managing her. As the door closed behind me, literally and metaphorically, because why not embrace the symbolism at this point? I let the house keep the echoes. The memories of better times, the ghost of who we used to be before hotel receipts and text messages, and 7 months of methodical betrayal. All of it could stay in that house with Sophie and her tears and her belated regret. I didn't need to carry any of it with me. That was the whole point of the clean break, the surgical precision of the revenge, to cut away the infected parts and walk away healthy, or at least healthier than I would have been if I'd stayed and tried to work through it. Some things, once shattered, shouldn't be rebuilt. This is true for grandmother's china, and it's true for marriages built on foundations that turned out to be sand instead of concrete. You can glue a broken plate back together, but everyone can see the cracks, and you'll never trust it to hold weight again. We'll never use it for anything important. We'll just keep it on a shelf as a reminder that once upon a time it was whole. I didn't want to be a cracked plate on a shelf. I didn't want to be the marriage that everyone whispered about. Oh, they're still together, but she cheated on him. Can you imagine? The cautionary tale at dinner parties about the cost of forgiveness. Sometimes the best punchline is the one they never see coming. I thought about this as I put the car in reverse and backed out of the driveway, watching the house get smaller in my rearview mirror like it was a place I used to live instead of a place I'd lived until literally 5 minutes ago. Sophie had made jokes about my cluelessness, had laughed about keeping secrets from her oblivious husband, had probably entertained Adrian with stories about how easy it was to deceive me, how I never asked questions or noticed inconsistencies or posed any threat to their careful arrangement. The joke was on her, obviously. The joke had been on her for months while she thought she was getting away with something. The joke was that I'd noticed everything, documented everything, prepared for everything, and then waited for exactly the right moment to reveal that the fool she'd been playing wasn't a fool at all. He was just an actor waiting for his cue. And the punchline? The punchline was her on her knees, surrounded by evidence of her own choices, realizing too late that the person she'd underestimated had been 3 steps ahead the entire time. Oliver called as I was driving, because of course he did. He'd probably been watching his phone waiting for the signal that it was over. "How'd it go?" he asked, and I could hear the espresso machine running in the background because Oliver's morning routine involves approximately 17 shots of espresso and the kind of nervous energy that makes him unable to sit still. "It's done," I said, and even saying it out loud felt surreal, like I was describing something that had happened to someone else in a story I'd read instead of something I'd just experienced. "She signed the house away. The accounts are frozen. She's got until 5 to get her stuff out." Holy shit, man. How do you feel? How did I feel? That was the question, wasn't it? I should feel triumphant or vindicated or satisfied or any of those big emotions that come with successful revenge plots. Instead, I just felt tired. Tired in a good way, like after finishing a marathon or completing a project you've been working on forever, that exhausted satisfaction that comes from closing a chapter you've been stuck on for too long. I feel free, I finally said, and realized it was true. Free from the lying, free from the pretending, free from the weight of maintaining a performance while building a case, free from a relationship that had become a prison I didn't even realize I was in until I'd executed my own elaborate escape plan. "Where are you headed?" Oliver asked. "No idea," I admitted, and it was possibly the most honest thing I'd said in months. "Away. Somewhere new. Somewhere that doesn't have hotel receipts and text messages and memories of someone who loved me before she decided I wasn't worth staying faithful to. You need a place to crash. My couch is available. It's not comfortable, but it's free and I make really good coffee." "You make terrible coffee," I corrected him. "You make espresso that tastes like anger and poor life choices. But yeah, I might take you up on that." I drove without a destination, which felt appropriately metaphorical for someone who'd just blown up their entire life in the most calculated way possible. The sun was coming up properly now, not just that pre-dawn grayness, but actual sunlight, and it occurred to me that I'd started and ended my marriage in a single morning. Started the ending, anyway, which had actually begun months ago when I'd first seen that text message calling me clueless. The revenge was complete. The plan had worked better than I'd hoped, honestly. Sophie was left with nothing she hadn't brought into the marriage herself, which wasn't much considering she'd spent most of her resources, emotional, financial, temporal, on an affair that had now cost her everything. Adrian was dealing with his own implosion, his marriage and career and comfortable double life all crashing down because men who brag about affairs to colleagues eventually get caught by wives who forward everything to HR. And me? I was driving away from the wreckage with my dignity intact, my assets protected, and the satisfaction of knowing I'd outplayed someone who thought she was playing a game I didn't even know existed. It wasn't sweet. It wasn't bitter. It was just finished, finally, completely, irreversibly finished.